Things are getting desperate as we reach the heart of Weiss's nightmare in episode 5 of Ice Queendom. Spoilers ahead for those who haven't seen the episode, as I won't be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I'll leave a link in the description below so you guys can go to either Crunchyroll or Rooster Teeth first, watch the episode there, and support the series. This episode starts off right where last episode ended, with the confrontation between Nightmare Weiss, Blake, and RWBY. And Weiss is once again saying that Faunus are not welcome here, that she sees all Faunus as the ones who hate humanity. Blake, of course, is trying to tell her that all Faunus aren't that way, just a small section of them, but it does seem, at least in Weiss's nightmare, that she views all Faunus as the ones who hate humanity, which is something I said in previous reviews, that I think the White Fang in Weiss's dream is meant to be representative of how she views all Faunus in the nightmare. Now, this isn't necessarily how Weiss herself thinks, but the nightmare is drawing from Weiss's memories, drawing from how she has felt either currently or at one point in time, highlighting the negative aspects of Weiss's personality. So, regardless of if she feels this way right at this point in time, she has felt that way at some point. So Weiss, at the very beginning of the RWBY series, really not a good person at all. She's telling Blake to get away from RWBY, to get away from her precious Imperial subjects. And RWBY latches on to that word, precious, implying that Weiss does care about RWBY. Of course, Blake retorts that, oh, and you just lock them away in a tower, and then Weiss retaliates by attacking, and the battle commences. Blake is going to distract Weiss while RWBY goes to find Yang, and both of them can go to search for the nightmare. As RWBY runs off, Weiss tells Grumpy Klein to go after her, taking the Imperial soldiers with him, and she hands Winter to the dog Klein. And the dog sneezes. So it looks like the dog Klein is in fact Sneezy Klein, and the only Klein we have left to see is Bashful Klein. And because of the nature that Bashful Klein would likely have, being more infatuated with Weiss, wanting to do everything he could for her, etc., I have a feeling that Bashful Klein, once he is introduced, which I assume we're going to be introduced to all 7 of the dwarves, considering we have 6 of them already, I think Bashful Klein might actually turn out to be an ally for RWBY, Weiss, and Blake, considering they are wanting to help Weiss, and they might be able to convince Bashful Klein to help them in return. So we'll wait and see what happens with that, but it is now confirmed that we have a sneezing dog in the RWBY series. But now, after leaving Blake to fight against Weiss, RWBY enters the next kind of section of Weiss's dream. She's standing on an infinity symbol of 2 snakes devouring each other, very symbolic of the Ouroboros from alchemy, symbolizing destruction and recreation, the infinite cycle of death and rebirth. And there's a lot of meaning that is in this, but considering destruction and creation are things that are representative in the entire RWBY series, there's definitely something to draw from there, as well as with Weiss and the nightmare itself. That this dream is sort of a continuous loop, that Weiss is trapped in this nightmare. We've already seen as Team RWBY, or at least RWBY the first time, and then the rest of her team along with her, have delved into the dream 2 different times now, and things have played out the same. The dream is on repeat. Things are moving in a continuous cycle. I think that is part of the representation here. There's probably a lot more to that I'm just not getting in my first initial reaction, so let me know what you think about the Ouroboros being represented here in Weiss's nightmare. RWBY then uses one of her coins to create another door to connect to the one that was present in the kind of bunk bed room, in the cell that RWBY and Yang were supposed to be staying in, so that she can go and get Yang. When she does, Yang immediately realizes what the plan is, that they need to go search for the nightmare while Blake is distracting Nightmare Weiss. And this kind of makes RWBY a little bit insecure. This wasn't a plan that she came up with, and she didn't really mention it to Yang, but Yang, just based on intuition, was able to tell what the plan was. And RWBY kind of starts to doubt herself as a leader. Yang tells her not to really worry about it, and both of them go to the Ouroboros snake and try to figure out what to do. RWBY holds up the relic, thinking that that would help, and the snakes move, opening up the path to where they need to go next. And at this point, Yang praises RWBY for her talent as a leader, that she knew what to do, which makes RWBY happy. Now, you know, knowing that the relic is important, it just seems logical to try that, but I like seeing that Yang is praising her sister, trying to raise her up a little bit, but that also kind of plays into Weiss's frustration with Yang, that she's coddling RWBY a little bit. So, you know, this dynamic is definitely present in this episode. But one thing I do want to point out, an actual error in this episode. We see very briefly as RWBY and Yang are talking inside their prison cell, inside the room, that Sleepy Klein wakes up briefly, notices that RWBY and Yang are talking, oh good, they're still there, and then goes back to sleep. However, Sleepy Klein's eyes are the wrong color. They're supposed to be purple, and in this scene they are green, which green is supposed to be Dopey Klein. Each of the Kleins have a different eye color representative of the emotion that they are supposed to represent, or the dwarf they're supposed to represent, and Sleepy Klein's eyes are supposed to be purple, whereas Dopey Klein's are green, and it seems like they got mixed up a little bit here. Very minor error, not really anything serious at all, but, you know, something that I noticed nonetheless. Before RWBY and Yang can actually progress further into Weiss's nightmare, Grumpy Klein does show up along with the Imperial soldiers, so another obstacle now stands in their way. One thing I do want to mention, when Yang first saw the Ouroboros, or the two snakes devouring each other, she did say that, oh, it really does look like we are inside Weiss's heart. So somehow she saw this as representative of Weiss. I don't know if that was meant to be an insult or just referencing, you know, how confusing Weiss seems to be on the inside, or perhaps that somehow snakes or vipers are representative of Weiss. Like, it was demonstrated in the previous episode and is very apparent in this episode that Yang does not have a positive view of Weiss, but I'll touch on that a bit more later. In the meantime, we see what is happening between Blake and Weiss. And while Blake is trying to hold her own, Weiss is reminding her of how much of a nuisance she is, constantly coming back into Weiss's empire every time she is driven out, over and over, a constant nuisance, something that is always on Weiss's mind. But Blake isn't really given a chance to process this information as she begins to be overwhelmed by Weiss. Weiss uses her glyphs to start summoning dust cartridges to replace the ones she used in her Myrtenaster, and then goes further to use her glyphs to summon Grimm to fight against Blake. It makes complete sense that Weiss in her nightmare would be able to have the full capabilities of glyphs that she knows are possible from seeing her sister and possibly her mother as well demonstrate how that semblance works. Weiss in the original RWBY series doesn't get the ability to summon until Volume 3. That's when it's first revealed to us, but Weiss obviously knew about it before then, and she is able to use it in her nightmare, and use it to great effect at that. She is able to summon 3 Grimm at one time. Massive Ursa appear and start attacking Blake, forcing her to use 2 of her coins to create 2 different decoys to flee from the battle. Now, one thing I find interesting about this, it does seem that Weiss targeted the clones, targeted the decoys. First of all, Blake didn't use her semblance, probably because there wasn't enough time, and her clones are more stationary than the decoys that would be made from the coins, but Weiss specifically targeted the decoy and then saw Blake escape. But by creating the decoy, I wonder if that actually tricks Weiss's mind into thinking that the decoy is in fact Blake, so Weiss is kind of aggroed onto the decoy, allowing Blake to escape. Because really, I wouldn't think that Weiss would fall for that trick in reality, but in the dream, she certainly did. I find that just interesting how things work within the dream. Regardless though, Blake is able to escape from Weiss. And then we cut back to RWBY and Yang, and we've pretty much skipped the entire fight against all of the Imperial soldiers. All of the soldiers are down, and it's just RWBY and Yang facing off against Grumpy Klein, who, although he was wielding a saber before, now has a Gatling gun as part of his arm, and is firing shots at RWBY and Yang. But it doesn't take very long for RWBY to fire off a sniper shot, getting the hang of her new weapon as how it's now backwards, is able to take out the Gatling gun, and Yang punches Grumpy Klein into oblivion. And his eyes fade, and it seems like Grumpy Klein is deactivated at least, if not just completely taken out. But being Weiss's dream, he'll probably be back up and running in no time. Regardless though, RWBY and Yang are able to make their way further into Weiss's nightmare. They first enter a kind of massive garden with a pillar in the center that is covered in vines and the Schnee symbol floating at the top. RWBY is able to use the relic that she has to cause the vines to part, a way to get into the core of Weiss's heart. And as they pass through that opening, they enter an almost cathedral sort of building, where there is another door covered in vines that the relic is able to remove. They then contact Blake via the scroll and use another coin to create a checkpoint to allow Blake to get to them. And now that they are reunited, Blake informs them of everything that she saw when fighting Weiss, how she was able to summon Grimm, and how she's, more powerful. But after having used a number of coins, they do take stock of the remaining ones they have left. And in total, there is 4. Blake and RWBY each have 1, and Yang still has 2 of her coins. So RWBY decides that she will save her last coin for their escape from the nightmare. And Yang says that once they enter the very core of Weiss's nightmare, she'll use a coin to call Shion and let them know what is happening. So they pass through the doorway and enter a concert hall, with the nightmare at the center stage. But, very curiously, in the nightmare's grasp is Weiss's Volume 4 to Volume 5 outfit, the same one that is worn by Pyrrha, though mirrored in Pyrrha's colors. This concert hall being very reminiscent of the place where Weiss first sang Mirror Mirror, the very song that Pyrrha sang in the last episode. Again, Ice Queendom is doing so brilliantly with the imagery and everything that is so symbolic of Weiss and how she's trying to fight against the nightmare, how things are represented in her dream, and how the nightmare is holding her heart prisoner, represented by this dress. Now, it's different than what I thought in the last episode, as, the coffin that was apparent with the apple on it, very symbolic of, Snow White. The entire fairy tale that Weiss draws her inspiration from, holding the relic that was the mirror to the one that RWBY had. I figured that that would be Weiss's heart being imprisoned, but it seems like the nightmare itself has a firm grasp on Weiss's heart. And it also seems that the nightmare actually isn't stored within the book that is Winter, but instead is more using Winter as an influence on Weiss. So, interesting how we're figuring out things work within the nightmare, but now that they found the nightmare, they know exactly what to do. They just need to kill it. So as Yang goes to make the telephone to go call Shion, it doesn't work out so well, because Weiss follows right behind them. After Blake had run from Weiss, Whitley showed up to tell Weiss exactly what was going on, that RWBY and Yang had escaped, and Blake was just a decoy, and had played her. So Weiss immediately went to the core of her nightmare, this most sacred place, and is now defending the nightmare itself. She jumps across the stage and stands to protect the nightmare, as the curtains close behind her, blocking the nightmare off from the rest of Team RWBY. And in a single blow, Weiss is able to send RWBY, Blake, and Yang flying out of the concert hall back into the cathedral area that we saw before. And we see a beautiful scene of RWBY looking up at Weiss, as Weiss is telling her and asking her, "Why did you betray me?" Saying that she needs to protect what is precious to her, and RWBY apologizes to Weiss, saying that she misunderstood, that she doesn't know what is precious to Weiss, which kind of makes sense. They've only really known each other for like a month or so, and it's very difficult to know someone that intimately within that short of time. RWBY wants to understand Weiss, and obviously in the dream, Weiss wants RWBY to understand her as well, and in probably a roundabout way wants to understand RWBY as well, but there is a disconnect, mostly due to Weiss's insecurities that are on full display within this nightmare. And instead of continuing to berate RWBY, instead Weiss goes after Yang, saying that she's disappointed in her for coddling RWBY. It's Yang's fault that RWBY ended up like this, kind of implying to me that Weiss wants RWBY to be more, wants RWBY to be better, and has hopes for her, but is blaming Yang for RWBY's childish nature, that she didn't have a chance to grow up. But the thing is, RWBY's 2 years younger than everyone. She wouldn't be as grown up as everyone else, which I think is something that Weiss is kind of missing the point on, at least in her own inner world. She doesn't quite seem to understand that RWBY is still a child compared to the rest of them. 2 years makes a lot of difference from the age of 15 to 17, so, you know, RWBY has a lot of time to grow, something that we've seen her able to do throughout the RWBY series, and same in Weiss's case as well, how she grew from someone who had all of the views that are represented in this nightmare. The negative views held by negative Weiss, which, by the way, I didn't mention this in my last review, but everyone had collectively decided to refer to Weiss as negative Weiss, but I'm going to continue referring to her as Nightmare Weiss, as it's 2 syllables versus 3, and if I'm going to be constantly saying Nightmare Weiss or negative Weiss, I'm just going to prefer to say Nightmare Weiss. My own personal preference, but, you know, it's interchangeable between Nightmare Weiss and negative Weiss. Just want to make that clear. So at this point, Yang steps forward and is had it with Weiss. She's pissed off at Weiss's continuous attitude, how she's talking down to others, acting so arrogant and stuck up, and, well, Weiss doesn't really respond to that well as she begins attacking. She once again summons the Grimm, forcing Blake and Yang to use their last coins to each create a decoy, while RWBY tries to go to retrieve the relic that she dropped earlier. When Weiss had knocked all 3 of them out of the concert hall, RWBY actually dropped the relic, and it was encased in thorns. When RWBY reaches for it, the thorns actually scratch her. Something that Blake mentioned earlier in the episode, Shion had warned all of them never to touch the thorns of the nightmare. But here, as RWBY reaches for the relic, she's scratched, and we see her bleeding from this. She misses grabbing the relic, and the nightmare coils around it and destroys the relic that was essentially the key to Weiss's heart. RWBY continues to fight back against the Grimm, but one attack from Weiss that sends a flurry of dust attacks outwards is enough to overwhelm them, and RWBY has to use her last coin to allow each of them to escape from the nightmare. After getting so close, after delving so far into Weiss's nightmare, they are forced to flee. Weiss's abilities are just too overpowering, and they will have to try again. Shion is able to pull all 3 of them out of the dream, and seems completely exhausted after doing so. Likely having 3 people jump into the dream, all 12 of the coins utilized, it probably took a huge toll on Shion. We saw, as Team RWBY was in that final fight, that the dolls representing each of them started to fray, that even the Dreamcatcher itself, strands of it started to break. It is very clear that there was a lot of strain put on Shion near the end of this jump into the nightmare, when each of them were fighting against Nightmare Weiss. But that's not the only thing that we notice upon Team RWBY waking up. RWBY's hand is still injured, but not just a simple scratch that she got in her dream. It seems like her hand is more injured than that. There's wounds seemingly all around it. And this makes me wonder, if RWBY was scratched by the thorns, obviously if you get injured in the dream by the nightmare, you're injured in real life. So if the nightmare kills you in the dream, you probably die in real life as well. You know, happy thoughts all around there, but I wonder, since it was stated earlier on that the nightmares use people's dreams as a breeding ground, that they start to multiply, if RWBY is scratched by the thorns, does that mean she's now infected by the nightmare as well? I'm curious to see if that's going to play out. One thing that I've mentioned in past reviews and past videos is that I really hope we do get to delve a little bit further into the mentality of some other people, whether it be RWBY, being the most prominent member of Team RWBY, the leader, and the one seemingly most connected to Weiss. It would make sense that if anyone else, we do delve into RWBY's nightmare maybe a little bit. If she is infected, maybe for only half an episode or something like that, we get to delve into her inner psyche and see the representation of her dream, of her own mentality. And it'd be great to see Yang and Blake as well, but at this point, if anything, I think we might get to delve into RWBY's nightmare at some point in time. At least, I hope. Regardless, though, the fact that the injury the nightmare gave her in the dream seems to be amplified in the real world, that it's much more severe, that's very dangerous to say the least. And I wonder if there's going to be some other negative repercussions of being injured by the nightmare within the dream, but we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Regardless, Shion has some bad news for Team RWBY. Shion can sense that each of the markers they had placed within the nightmare have now been destroyed. Likely because the nightmare has now seen RWBY, Blake, and Yang fighting against it, that they are trying to free Weiss, and so the nightmare has retaliated by altering Weiss's dream to some extent. Shion does mention that Weiss's dream shouldn't have changed that much or anything too drastic, but that does imply that there has been some change due to Team RWBY's failure at this point in time. And Shion also says that this third attempt that they will jump into Weiss's nightmare will likely be their last, because if they fail this time, Weiss's life will be in danger. In the time it would take for Shion's aura to recover, the nightmare could take Weiss's life. So third time's probably the charm, where they will have to free Weiss from the nightmare or risk losing her forever. Now, of course, we know that Weiss continues on into the future of the RWBY series, so we know that they're going to be able to rescue her, but how they're going to rescue her, break her from the curse of this nightmare, is going to be very interesting to see. And I really hope we see a lot of fantastic battles throughout all of this, with the powers of both Weiss, Blake, and Yang, as well as RWBY to some extent, being escalated in this dream world. I really hope that we get to see some very over-the-top fights in the future of this series. After hearing the somber news, RWBY, Blake, and Yang go to the cafeteria and are each struggling in their own way. RWBY is feeling very down about not being able to understand Weiss, thinking that she is actually precious to Weiss, but that Weiss is also pushing her away. She's very confused and very upset that she isn't able to understand Weiss. Yang is just pissed off with Weiss, saying that she's a selfish, stubborn little princess, putting on full display how she really feels about Weiss, something that was hinted at in last episode and something that is made very clear here. Yang does not see Weiss in a positive light. In fact, in last episode she said, "I don't even know if there is such a thing as a positive Weiss," when everyone else was suggesting calling the nightmare Weiss negative Weiss. So, Yang does not have positive views of Weiss, and you can't really blame her given Weiss's attitude. Blake seems to be the more logical of the three, saying that the nightmare is just trying to make them think that Weiss is that way, which I kind of agree with, I kind of don't. I think that Blake is just trying to convince herself of this, because the interaction that she just had with Weiss really implies, or really shows, how discriminatory Weiss is towards all Faunus and how she views all Faunus. Now I want to pause for a moment here and clarify that the nightmare isn't creating any of the things we see inside Weiss's dream. It is drawing from Weiss's own memories and drawing from her own insecurities. Everything present in the dream is something present within Weiss. But the nightmare, and Grimm in general being drawn to negative emotions, the nightmare can focus on those insecurities, and those are the ones that are going to be represented within the dream. The nightmare isn't altering them in any way. It is bringing them to the surface and pushing them to the forefront. It is not heightening them, and it is not fabricating anything. Everything that we are seeing within Weiss's nightmare is something that she either currently thinks or thought at one point in time. She held these memories, held these insecurities, and she is having difficulty changing from them. That is the entire point of Ice Queendom. Weiss wants to change, but she doesn't know if she can. She is struggling to do so. But that is pointed out in just a little bit. Each of them doesn't really know what to do. So Blake and Yang decide to walk away for a little while to get some air, and RWBY, left alone staring at her dinner plate, begins to cry, not knowing how to understand Weiss, not knowing how to help her. But someone else does see that she's in pain and moves over to help, that being Jean. And we then see RWBY talk with the rest of Team Juniper. The first question they ask is, how are they represented in Weiss's dream? And RWBY doesn't exactly know how to answer that, because in the case of Jean, Ren, and Nora, they are essentially Pyrrha's pets, almost, meowing and aren't really acting that human overall, aren't really capable of human speech. So RWBY instead just tells them that they are locked away in a prison. And in response to this, Ren and Pyrrha have a more positive spin on why things are locked away in Weiss's nightmare. Not because Weiss is ashamed of them and wants to keep them separate from her world, but because subconsciously she wants to protect what is precious to her from the nightmare itself. That is why RWBY and Yang were locked away in that tower, where Weiss kept all of her favorite things. She does consider Ruby and Yang as someone precious to her. Blake, it's a bit more complex than that, but Ren and Pyrrha are definitely onto something. Now, whether Weiss considers all of Team Juniper to be someone precious to her, and that's why she's locking them away, I don't necessarily buy that, because we kinda know what Weiss's opinion of Jean is, and it's not great, to be honest. She doesn't really care for him that much, and has never really interacted with Ren and Nora that much at all, so, you know, I don't necessarily consider Weiss wanting to protect them necessarily, but when Pyrrha relates it to Weiss's memories, the positive memories that she has at Beacon Academy, that makes more sense. That Team Juniper is representative of Weiss's memories at Beacon Academy, something that is precious to her and something that she wants to protect. Also, Pyrrha being someone that she seems to relate to quite heavily, that Pyrrha was singing Mirror Mirror and everything related to that, it does make sense why Weiss is trying to protect all of these different things, by keeping them away from the Nightmare's influence. And this prompts Jean to say that he wishes he could fight as well, that he could do something to help. And this gives Ruby an idea. But before we are let in on what Ruby's idea is, we see what's happening with Blake and Yang, as they have each run into some familiar faces. Yang ran into Penny, and Blake ran into Sun. Each of them giving the other an idea, and giving them motivation on how to move forward. As Yang is talking with Penny, Yang is mentioning how a friend of hers is stuck in a dream, and how things aren't exactly working out. And Penny relates dreams to maintenance. Being the android that she is, she's definitely made a lot more robotic in the way she sounds and the way she talks in Ice Queendom compared to the original RWBY series, but relating this to maintenance makes a lot of sense. She says that dreams are a way to process excess information, and in maintenance you can swap out different information to try to find a different result. That's what she's relating it to, at least, and this gives Yang the idea to try to swap out the dreams. And in Blake's case, as she's talking to Sun, telling Sun about everything that happened in Weiss's nightmare, Sun points out that since the version of Blake in Weiss's nightmare is constantly being pushed out and coming back, that just shows how much she's on Weiss's mind. And also proves that Weiss, in her own subconscious, has accepted Blake as someone important to her, showing that Blake does have the capability to actually change Weiss's view. Sun kind of does refer to Weiss as the Faunus hater, but, you know, she did start out that way, but as of the end of Volume 1, she wants to change. She wants to be able to overlook that past part of herself. And that is going to be representative as we move forward in Ice Queendom. Again, a lot of negative things are present in Weiss's mind, showing that she was a terrible person. Not necessarily that she is now, but she definitely was at one point in time. At the very beginning of the RWBY series, when we first met her, before Team RWBY was able to start changing the way that she views the world, and views the Faunus, and the people that were once considered lesser than herself. And as a result of this conversation with Sun, this gives Blake renewed confidence. She knows what she needs to do, and will continue to try to change Weiss's mind. The same kind of values that the White Fang started out with, but after continuous rejection turned to violence. But violence isn't the answer. And so I think Blake is going to try a more diplomatic approach with Weiss. So everyone reconvenes with Xion and Ozpin to let Xion know the plan that they are trying to come up with. And Xion, for the most part, agrees with their ideas, telling Yang that her idea to change Weiss's dream is in fact possible, which kind of adds even another aspect to Xion's semblance, that Xion can actually somehow alter the dream of the person who is affected by the nightmare, which, you know, we've seen a little bit already by the fact that Xion's coins are able to alter it to some extent, but the fact that Xion might be able to alter the dream as a whole, that's another level of Xion's semblance. But Ozpin also has some understanding about how the dreams work, and adds that the change could only be possible if the dreamer sees it as a positive change. In other words, if it's something that Weiss would actually want, that her mind would allow to happen. All of Team RWBY, though, seems confident that this change will be allowed in Weiss's dream. All of them realize that Weiss has been fighting just as much as they have, that she wants to change, and each of them want to be able to tell Weiss that it's okay to do so. They are gaining a deeper understanding of the struggles that Weiss is going through, and they want to help her. Each of them wanting the chance to talk to Weiss and let her know that it's okay. Ruby's idea was actually to bring Jean with them into the nightmare. And Xion points out that that's actually not a bad idea. There is some precedent to this. Apparently, at some point in the past, Xion had tried this with someone who had already been infected with the nightmare, sending them into the dream of someone else afflicted by the nightmare. In this case, Jean, being a previous victim of the nightmare, still has the memories of being afflicted by it. And so, if he entered Weiss's dream, the nightmare would see him as no threat, would just see him as another individual that was already afflicted by the nightmare. And so he would pretty much be able to walk around freely, as if he was invisible. Or as Nora put it, as if he just wasn't important at all. Which, you know, Nora being Nora, just very blunt and to the point. Regardless, there are some risks associated with this. Xion mentions that the closer Jean gets to the nightmare itself, the more severe of a reaction he will have. Almost like an allergy, that he'll get itchy, that he'll have trouble breathing, and if the nightmare does reject him, and it's strong enough, Jean could just die of shock. So, you know, he's a little bit nervous about doing so, but he does want to do what he can to help Weiss. And Pyrrha, of course, is there to give him some encouragement and try to give him the confidence to do what he needs to do. Xion then mentions that they need to find the key to Weiss's heart. There's going to be something else that looks pretty much the exact same as the relic they had already found. In other words, what they need to search for now is the relic that is locked away in the coffin. This being the key to Weiss's heart. Again, hearkening back to what I said in the last review, the fact that there are the two relics, one of them white, one of them red, one left with where Weiss feels at home in the Schnee Manor, and one where, you know, the alternate version of Ruby was at home in the dream world, in Ruby's bunk bed, definitely seeing the White Rose connections here, but also just the fact that Weiss wants to understand Ruby and feels close to Ruby, or wants to be close to Ruby. More so as friends, likely in this case, but still, it is definitely very symbolic. But that means that Team RWBY and Jean are now going to have to get to Weiss's, inner sanctum, the place where she feels most at home within the dream, break the relic out of this coffin, and then try to find the nightmare once again. Probably, if things have changed even slightly, the nightmare might have hidden itself in somewhere other than the concert hall, and they'll have to track it down again. But Xion does remind them again that this time, if they are not successful in their third jump into Weiss's dream, it is very likely that Weiss will die while Xion's aura is recovering. So they had better succeed this time around. And so, all four of them, Jean, Ruby, Blake, and Yang, all dive into Weiss's nightmare together. And the last scene we see of the episode is Ruby, Blake, and Yang on the outskirts of Weiss's dream in the snowy tundra once again. But Jean is not with them, which sort of makes me think that since Ruby, Yang, and Blake are seen as outside entities to Weiss's nightmare, they're each transported to the outskirts of Weiss's dream. But Jean, since he's kind of immune to the nightmare, having previously been infected by one, maybe he just replaced the alternate version of himself in the Silly's jail, because the nightmare would see him as no threat whatsoever, wouldn't really acknowledge him at all, so maybe he's actually right in the core of Weiss's nightmare, which would make sense for the progress of the story given that all of the previous markers that had been placed in the last two jumps into Weiss's dream, both by Ruby and then Blake and Yang as well, all of them were destroyed. That's about 12-ish markers that were placed that have just been completely gone. A whole bunch of doorways leading from the outskirts of Weiss's nightmare all the way to the center. And if they need to replace all of them, well, they're only going to have 12 coins. This time split 4 ways, so each of them are only going to have 3 coins, and if Jean is already present kind of in the center of the city, he can create one marker, and then either RWBY, Blake, or Yang can create another, and then they can get a lot closer to where they were before. So I think that's likely how it's going to play out, because if all of them need to make it back to the center of the city and just go by foot, essentially, it's going to take them a lot longer to do so, and we do know that Xion's aura is drained the longer they are staying in the dream, so, you know, for the progression of the plot, I think that Jean is probably going to end up somewhere else and not arrive in the dream right next to Blake, Yang, and RWBY, but we'll have to wait and see. Overall, another wonderful episode of Ice Queendom, the end of episode 6 marking the halfway point of the series, and presumably we are already making the final jump into Weiss's nightmare. So I have a feeling that we're not going to spend all 6 of the next episodes focusing just on this one jump into Weiss's nightmare. I have a feeling that it might take 2 or 3 episodes to fully free Weiss from the nightmare, and then there's going to be something else that happens afterward. With the extent that the nightmare was able to feed off of Weiss's aura, I think that it's going to be a lot stronger than the one that affected Jean, because his aura was much more underdeveloped compared to Weiss's. And so when the nightmare escapes from Weiss, it's going to cause other problems around Beacon, and pose some other threat that will need to be overcome. Not going to be something as simple as Xion just snaring it with their strings and electrocuting it with dust, putting it in a jar and keeping it sealed. I think that this nightmare is going to pose a much greater threat, and we still need to see what's going to happen with that wound that RWBY got from the thorns. I am hoping that there's maybe an episode or a half of one that focuses on RWBY's insecurities, as it's been made very clear over these past couple episodes that she is very confused as to what to do. She's insecure about whether she can actually be a leader or not, whether she is actually important to her friends, Weiss in particular. RWBY's insecurities are very much on display as well, more so than, you know, Blake or Yang, but less so than Weiss, so I think it would make sense that we do get to see a little bit of RWBY's inner world as well. Help her get more on that path to being a leader that we see her on in Volume 2. There's still a lot to come in Ice Queendom that will bring us closer to the beginning of Volume 2 of the RWBY series and where we see the characters at. I am really looking forward to seeing how everything unfolds, and I hope you all are as well. So let me know what your thoughts are of Episode 6 of Ice Queendom in the comments down below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, want to see more like it, more Ice Queendom coverage, RWBY theories, etc., make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.